Hello? Is someone there? Would you donate any Shabriri Grapes in your possession to me? I'm on a pilgrimage, in search of the distant light. And when I eat one of those grapes, I can feel the light in the back of my eyes. Ah. Is that you over there? I've gleaned something very important indeed, thanks to you. The reason why it was eyes I had to eat. The distant light is far and frail.
How do you know that what you see is real? Probably this is not something you frequently ask yourself, but that's only because of intersubjectivity. That is to say, if many people see the same thing, then we agree it's probably real. But what if you start seeing things that other people don't see? Which one is real? The world that you see or the one that everyone else does? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. And most importantly, what would you do if you thought the world you experienced wasn't real? These are questions that philosophers and college freshmen alike have been asking for a very long time. And in Elden Ring, the question is posed through a horrifying and real world inspired story. The story of Vyke, Hyetta, the Shabriri Grapes, and the flame of frenzy. River blindness is the second leading cause of infectious blindness worldwide, affecting over 20 million people in 2017. It's caused, as opposed to causes of blindness perhaps more ordinary to the developed world, like diabetes or macular degeneration, by a parasitic worm, the filarial nematode Onchocerca volvulus. We are the obligate host for this worm, meaning it cannot survive without infecting us. Humans are infected by the bite of an adult black fly, which deposits larvae under the skin of us, the host. It's called river blindness because the risk of infection is related to being near a water source where the flies are spawning. These deposited larvae mature, then live under the skin for usually about a year before migrating under the skin and, of course, reproducing. The total number of these tiny parasitic worms in an infected host can reach 100 million. Once they start migrating, they seem to have a particular predilection for the eye, which is why they can cause blindness. Onchocerciasis, the medical name for this infection, causes blindness by directly infecting the eye, damaging the optic nerves and surrounding structures, often causing characteristic external features, making it quite easy to identify those affected by just looking at their eyes. The symptoms, especially if untreated, include an unbearably itchy skin rash, pain, progressive blindness, and even seizures, if the parasite makes it to the brain. These symptoms, while horrifying and alien to most of us, are just the facts of life in endemic areas, predominantly sub-Saharan Africa, with an estimated 200 million people still at risk of infection currently in the world today. And there are many other types of parasitic blindness beyond just river blindness. So common is the association between water and blindness that, in fact, many folktales and myths have sprung up to explain this connection. The Burkinabe people in West Africa, for example, tell a story of how, if you live too close to the river itself will eat your eyes. And in the Hebrew Bible, there is a demon that lurks in uncovered water at night and causes blindness in those who drink the water. The name of this demon is Shabriri. So, now you know where we're going with this. Elden Ring Shabriri, as has been pointed out by many internet sleuths early on in Elden Ring's life cycle, is indeed named after this demon of Hebrew mythology. But the story of that demon is in turn inspired by real-world parasitic infections that are associated with water and cause blindness. The game even makes it clear that frenzy is a transmissible disease, according to the inescapable frenzy description, which reads, quote, causes the yellow flame of frenzy to blaze from the caster's eyes. The caster then latches onto foes, spreading the madness, end quote. Importantly, the name Shabriri, as a reference to the folklore surrounding parasitic blindness, like river blindness, goes even further. And exploring these real-world inspirations can help us decipher the in-game story. Blindness, not specifically river blindness, but really any acquired blindness, can cause paradoxical visions called visual release phenomena, basically visual hallucinations, caused by your brain trying to fill in the gaps and create visual information after being deprived of it due to blindness. In other words, your brain is still trying to see, it just no longer has any actual visual information coming from the eyes, so it creates its own. People affected by this will describe anything from a simple hallucination like lines or shapes to far more complex ones like seeing faces or sometimes even entire scenes. So in a way, river blindness doesn't just cause blindness, but it actually changes what you see. And in Elden Ring, what is in your eyes definitely controls what you see. There's a nice parallel here with the Golden Runes, for example, the Lands Between rune, which reads, quote, grace said to have once dwelled in the eyes of the inhabitants of the Lands Between, the lingering residue of gold. No grace resides in the eyes of the tarnished. If it ever did, it is now lost. End quote. Credit to Reddit user Drew Ewing for pointing this out. The phrase dwelled in the eyes here is meant to be quite literal, of course, as we know that many characters recognize us as tarnished just by looking in our eyes, and even the eyes of our paterfamilias Godfrey faded characteristically one fateful day. The color of your eyes is basically diagnostic for the influence one is under during the game. And visually, the rune items, especially the more valuable ones, look more and more like actual eyes. FromSoft have kind of done this before with Cold Blood Dew in Bloodborne, consumable items that become increasingly arcane as they become more and more valuable, and it becomes increasingly evident what their true nature is. Likewise here, the more valuable rune items make it clear that what we are actually collecting comes from eyes. So the general notion seems to be that the influence of the three fingers manifests with river blindness eye, aka Shabriri grape, a kind of parasitic infection, while two fingers' influence manifests as golden eyes, referred to as the grace of gold. Of course, there's more than a little bit of orthodox propaganda in these item descriptions and terms. And in both cases, this influence clearly affects what we see. For example, as we discussed in our previous video, many NPCs are impressed that we can still see the guidance of grace at all, establishing that the world we see is somehow affected by whether or not we've been graced. Likewise, the description of the Golden Rune reads in part, quote, even now, runes are still imbued with the power of life itself. Do you see the Erd Tree towering over there? End quote. The implication of this question being that some people don't even see the Erd Tree at all. Similarly, the finger reader crone outside the walls of Landell asks us, with a certain tone of desperation,
surely you see it too. The gold that enshrouds the heavens. The great tree which begets the pillars of light.
We've gone into depth as to the other reasons why this might be the case in previous videos, so here let's just keep it simple. The only reason to ask if we see the gigantic golden tree towering in the distance, which of course would be an absurd question otherwise, is that not everyone can see it, just like not everyone can see the guidance of grace. Indeed, these days, the Erd tree is merely an object of faith. Likewise, the Shabriri grape, which causes a burning in the back of Hyetta's eye that also guides her, a distant light as she calls it, is inspired by visual hallucinations seen by the blind, including those afflicted with river blindness. Hyetta is guided by a light that only she can see. For context, this is an idea FromSoft have beautifully explored before with Bloodborne's Ludwig, who is guided by fleeting bits of light, a private, elusive sort of guidance. But that's a story for another day. So, being affected by the flame of frenzy appears to actually change what you see. This helps to explain why in the cutscene of the frenzied flame ending, there is a literal optic disc in the sky. Not only does it look like a real-life optic disc as you'd see on a fundoscopic exam, but if you compare the image of the sky to the artwork of the frenzied eye, it's identical. So there's a literal eye in the sky, a clear allusion to the fact that frenzy changes the world by changing how its adherents see it. So we ask again, what would you do if you started to doubt that the world you experienced visually wasn't the real one? Elden Ring offers one answer to this question through the tragic story of Fingerprint Vyke, once known as Round Table Knight Vyke. Vyke was a knight of the Round Table Hold, an adherent of the ancient dragon cult, and the most accomplished Tarnished prior to the player character's arrival, perhaps besides Lord Godfrey himself. Not only was he Lanciax's favorite, but he is the only one prior to us to have collected 2 Great Runes. So why didn't he mend the Elden Ring then? Well, we are told he fell to the Flame of Frenzy, apparently seduced with the possibility of saving his maiden from her gruesome death as kindling for the Flame of Ruin. Though this intention is undoubtedly noble, it set him down a dark path, and he was, according to the Fingerprint Grape description, ultimately embraced by the 3 fingers, his skin seared with their indelible mark. These seared marks, by the way, may also be inspired by river blindness, which causes unbearably itchy skin lesions. Over time, these lesions harden like scale, and sometimes the itch is so intense that sufferers have been known to burn their own skin just to get relief. We get this item, by the way, from Vyke himself after he invades us as Festering Fingerprint Vyke. So Vyke inherited the Flame of Frenzy, but we know he didn't trigger the Frenzied Flame ending because, well, the world still exists. So what happened? Well, in the Lord Contender's Everjail, we see him imprisoned, and critically, he's somehow been cured of frenzy. His moniker has changed back to Round Table Knight Vyke, and he's using his Red Lightning incantations instead of the Frenzied Flame incantations. At first glance, it's easy to write this off as simply another case of temporal shenanigans. The flow of time is convoluted and whatnot. But actually, closer inspection of the forensics tells a different story. Because the fingerprint grape tells us that this is actually Vyke's eye, and we can even see a fingerprint on the eye itself, indicating that Vyke, with his flesh already seared, gouged his own eye out. And if the flame of frenzy manifests in one's eyes, perhaps enucleation, the process of removing an eyeball, would provide a cure. We do know one way to disinherit the frenzied flame, Miquella's needle, but that seems to be a totally separate process. After all, there are countless people affected by the Flame of Frenzy in the game, represented visually by the yellow frenzied eyes, but only one who has actually inherited the flame itself, represented by the seared flesh. So it's best to treat these two as separate processes. Perhaps Vyke, after inheriting the frenzied flame, but eventually overcome with guilt about this path and unable to see it to completion, decided to tear out the source of frenzy, removing his own eye, and imprison himself in an Everjail as penance, and to ensure that he would never be in a position to bring about the frenzied chaos. Perhaps that is why the frenzied spirit outside the frenzied flame village speaks with such apparent disappointment when he says, quote, "Ah, Lord Vyke, it seems you were no lord after all. Then where is he, our true lord, our lord of frenzied flame?" End quote. This fits quite nicely with the notion that Vyke reneged on his plan to become the lord of frenzied flame, opting instead to tear out his own eye and repent. This religious connotation fits quite well with another real-world inspiration, the fact that autoenucleation, the process of removing one's eyes, in reality a manifestation, of course, of psychosis, has long been associated in the psychological literature with ideas of Christian guilt, going all the way back to Freud, who linked it to the Oedipal complex. More scientific researchers than Freud have pointed out that this horrifying act is far less common in non-Christian cultures, and many people who have removed their own eyes actually state they believe they either deserve this fate as punishment for sin or can save some aspect of the world by removing their own eyes. One young woman who in 2017 had a psychotic episode while on methamphetamine stated that she believed she had to sacrifice her eyes to save the world. So, gouging one's own eyes out for penance is nothing new, and in Vyke's case, may have actually clarified him such that he is no longer affected by the Flame of Frenzy at all. The Lands Between narrowly avoided disaster, only to wait for a new tarnish to come along and be confronted with the same dilemma, to sacrifice his maiden and burn down the Erd Tree, or to save his maiden but condemn the world to frenzied chaos. What that tarnished ultimately chooses depends entirely on how they see the world. Next time, as we continue this story, we will unravel the real-world inspirations for the 2 and 3 finger schism, and what they can tell us about the ever-mysterious 3 fingers.